Vermont Electric Cooperative, lighting the path to affordable clean energy together.
EVs have a lot of inherent flexibility in them, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And my sense is that they're sort of like a Swiss Army knife. Like they can be used for all sorts of different things to help the grid. But today, people are like buying the Swiss Army knife and then just using one tool on it. And it's primarily like peak load deferral, right? Because it's like, it's the most obvious one. It's probably the most lucrative one. It's the easiest one to implement and to manage on a steady basis. At the same time, talking to so many different co-ops, like it's clear that everyone is sort of doing things with two minds, right? It's like, what are the challenges of today that we're actually trying to solve? And then like looking forward and not even that far forward. Like what is the stuff that we know we're going to have to evolve into in the not too distant future and really start to like use EVs for more value streams at the end of the day to like make this whole thing work.
Welcome to Vermont Electric Cooperative's virtual power plant series, Sweet Watts, where we focus on the people, learning, and strategies of our VPP programs. I'm your host, Cyril Brunner, and in this episode, I'm joined by Jossi Fritz from FlexCharging. We discuss managed charging, the challenges of chargers and telematics programs, what has worked well so far for VEC, and what the future holds in the managed charging space. Electric vehicles, if left unmanaged, will cause electric infrastructure impacts and will also cause an increase in transmission costs for utilities. On the infrastructure side of things, VEC has seen that the average level 2 charging speed is about 7.8 kilowatts. VEC's average transformer size is a 10 kVA and averages about 1.2 meters per transformer, which doesn't leave a lot of headroom, especially if folks are electrifying heating with heat pumps. Locally, VEC is already upgrading around 20 transformers a year for EV-related overloading. Some of our feeders have more than 7% EV adoption, and we anticipate seeing larger system issues within the next 2 to 5 years. With smart management, we can greatly reduce the impact on infrastructure and save our members from increases to transmission costs. VEC began its managed EV charging program in early 2020 and now has over 300 EV chargers and 60 electric vehicles enrolled. We have around 700 all-electric and plug-in EVs in our territory, so we're currently managing around half of those devices. That management comes in a couple of different flavors. The largest portion, almost 250 EV chargers, are managed through direct connection with the device and are dispatched 4 to 6 times per month for around 3 to 5 hours. VEC has direct connections to Emporia, ChargePoint, and Flow chargers. Members receive an $8 a month bill credit for not charging during those peak events, and most of the members are also enrolled in VEC's free level 2 charger program. For folks with non-compatible chargers or Wi-Fi connection issues, VEC offers a scheduled charger program whereby a member will manually enter a schedule into their charger, send a screenshot to VEC, and then also receive that $8 a month bill credit. In April, we launched a telematics program with FlexCharging. Members are compensated the same $8 a month for participating in peak events while charging at home. We currently have around 60 members enrolled in the telematics program, with Tesla representing the majority of vehicle OEMs enrolled. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jossi. I'm very excited to welcome today's guest, Jossi Fritz, who is the Director of Program Management at FlexCharging. Jossi is a tremendous resource for VEC and is our primary contact at FlexCharging. In addition to providing support for our existing telematics program, he coordinates an EV working group amongst other cooperatives working with FlexCharging, with the goal of sharing what others have learned in the EV management space. He and the FlexCharging team embrace the value of sharing, collaborating, and learning in this quickly evolving EV management space, and we love working with Jossi and the team for that exact reason. Thanks for being on Sweet Walks, Jossi.
Thanks, man. Long-time listener, first-time caller, so happy to be here.
Love it. Can you talk to me a little bit about your background? How did you find your way into the energy industry and what brought you to FlexCharging?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was in college when I figured out that climate change is like the number one moral issue facing us. And I knew I wanted to center my professional and personal life around working around there. And I found my way to clean energy pretty quickly, in part because it was, I'll say, like the most optimistic and sort of practical avenue to work on this stuff. I mean, you can go down the list of all the things that need to happen from a climate change standpoint. But I think when it comes to clean energy, a lot of it is about we already have so many of the technologies we need, and it's just figuring out how to deploy them. And that really spoke to me on a practical level. And so most of my career has been in the utility space, either on the co-op side or even on the larger IOU side. And just broadly speaking in clean energy, I mean, everything from like solar to storage, energy efficiency, demand response, electrification of all kinds. And then a couple of years ago, I was ready, both for personal and professional reasons, to sort of like do something that was a little bit more dynamic. I wanted to get back to working for a smaller organization. I was at a really large utility at the time. And also, if I could, I wanted to move into the electrification space because that's where stuff is really changing super quickly. And so I found my way to FlexCharging, and you know, I tell people that like I've been doing utility program design and management for a long time. I was just doing it on the utility side. Now I'm doing it on the vendor side, but like a lot of the challenges are the same. But the fun part for me now is that I get to, you know, have bunch of those conversations with a bunch of different co-ops and utilities, and so I get to tackle even more challenges, which I think is fun. And you know, the last piece I'll say is that like there's a whole lot happening in this space. I was super impressed by our founder Brian Grunke-Meyer's. He's got a big data analytics background, and all that stuff technically was really cool. But the other piece I really liked is that he got into this originally because he was worried that his utility wasn't taking seriously the electrification stuff, particularly around like how to optimize charging around emissions. And I think that that focus on emissions, even though on a day-to-day basis, we don't have as many co-ops and utilities asking for that, that really spoke to my value set. I recognize that in him as well. And I was excited to be part of a company that, you know, long-term wants to be hopefully helping to shape how this stuff practically plays out as the grid decarbonizes at the same time.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's great to hear that you feel like you're having an impact in that space. I mean, that's you know, this relationship that we have through FlexCharging and you know, the work that we do together, right, is like most fun part of like my job, and like learning from what others are doing, the stuff that you guys share. It's all like really great. So that makes a lot of sense. A little bit on a tangent here outside the energy space. What's one thing that you're most passionate about outside of that kind of passion for trying to solve climate change and electrification?
I am an obsessed runner. I run like 60 to 70 miles a week.
Wow.
I've never met a trail that I didn't like. We're lucky to live 3 minutes from a trail. It's much of the reason we bought the house where we did, so that I can run on single track trails all the time. And just like, I think it makes me a better colleague, a better husband, a better father, a better person, just to have that daily time where I can center myself and just get out there and just to connect this back to the professional sense. I'll say that the process of running is often about just like you set like a long-term goal for yourself, like, you know, often it's around a race or something like that, and you just like on a day-to-day basis, you're following a process to get better, and it may be hard to see progress on a daily basis, but it all adds up to something in the end. And that really speaks to me philosophically, you know, this idea that like it's the accumulation of like small, steady efforts that actually leads to change, not just like waking up one day and saying, I'm going to run like 30 miles and I'm going to get in shape that way. I mean, that's not what it's about. In fact, that's a recipe for burnout and failure.
Awesome. You know, I listen to a lot of running podcasts as a fellow trail runner. And so it's great that we've somehow managed to weave both of these together. I also find, you know, very similar value in running. Maybe less so on this kind of small steps piece and just a place to kind of like step away and think about whatever. A lot of like the thoughts that I have for work are ended up generated by those very runs. Some time away sometimes is the clarity that, you know, brings you there. So
yeah, it's always hard when you have great ideas and then you're like, oh, I got no way to write this down now.
That's right. That's right. That's why I always bring a phone with me. It's like a little bit of a blessing and a curse, but otherwise I'm stuck with that idea or I lose it, which is awful. You know, in the intro to this episode, I spent some time laying out how EVs are impacting VC's grid, you know, with a particular focus on peak management and impacts to grid infrastructure. With your work at FlexCharging and working with a variety of co-ops and utilities, what are you seeing across the country? Are those impacts similar? Are folks just as concerned? Does that vary?
Yeah, I think that uh, EVs have a lot of inherent flexibility in them, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And my sense is that they're sort of like a Swiss Army knife. Like they can be used for all sorts of different things to help the grid. But today, people are like buying the Swiss Army knife and then just using one tool on it, and it's primarily like peak load deferral, right? Because it's like it's the most obvious one. It's probably the most lucrative one. It's the
Yep.
easiest one to implement and to manage on a steady basis. At the same time, talking to so many different co-ops, like it's clear that everyone is sort of doing things with two minds, right? It's like, what are the challenges of today that we're actually trying to solve? And then like looking forward and not even that far forward. Like what is the stuff that we know we're going to have to evolve into in the not too distant future and really start to like use EVs for more value streams at the end of the day to like make this whole thing work. So it's exciting to have those sort of phase conversations. Folks are going about it really differently, which is part of what's super interesting to me. In terms of like how quickly they're rolling out new stuff, how far off they think that stuff is, things like that. But it's definitely today, like everyone's just chasing that peak load deferral. But there's definitely really rich conversations and planning happening around doing the other stuff. And we're definitely working behind the scenes and frankly, like with co-ops like VEC about like, hey, where do you think this is going? Okay, can we like build that so that we're ready when you're ready to do that?
Yeah, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I often say that this technology space is very nascent. There's like a lot of maturity that needs to happen, especially even in EV management, which is arguably like one of the more mature spaces in the VPP space, especially as it relates to additional grid services, right? I think the peak management one is you can push a button, you can send a signal, whether that's a rate signal or an actual physical signal to a vehicle. That stuff can happen pretty easily, I would say, in the grand scheme, right? Some of these other things, T&D asset deferral, vehicle to grid, there's just like technology hurdles, member behavior hurdles, regulatory hurdles, even in the rate space, to just get the right signals going to folks, right? So there's just we always say like let's build these programs now, let's get going now, even though like a lot of the value might only come 5-10 years down the pipe, because it's gonna be much harder to get that stood up when we have thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, across the nation that are being connected.
Yeah, yeah. And just adding on to that, I mean, like, I think you have to like be present in the moment in terms of like doing the programs the right way, but not get too comfortable with status quo because
Yep.
stuff is changing. And like more and more when we're doing like kickoffs with new co-ops, it's explicitly around like a phased program approach of like, here's the next 6 to 9 months, and here's the 9 to 18 months after
Yep.
that. Like they're thinking through those steps in program design, especially because they know that what they're launching today is not going to be what members necessarily are going to see from them a year from now, and they want to be able to build into as this other stuff becomes more viable.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Um, we've had managed charger program for several years here at VC. We manage around 250 chargers. It's a mix of ChargePoint, Flow, Emporia chargers. We also have some chargers that we just set a schedule on because folks might have issues with Wi-Fi connections. What are some of the challenges that you've seen with charger programs themselves? They're obviously incredibly valuable to us today. They are the largest by quantity that we have, but there is, a lot of hassle associated with those and some very clear challenges. Talk to me about those a little bit.
Yeah, this is one where I can speak on both sides of it, both with like working with co-ops and utilities that have rolled this out and have been generous enough to talk to us, and also just like when I was at my last job and like seeing our own challenges, and they definitely dovetail quite a bit. I mean, part of it is that like, again, like change is the name of the game, like the landscape is changing. You see more OEMs when you buy an EV, just sort of giving those stuff away. So if a co-op or utility is offering like a free or discounted charger, that value proposition doesn't really land with someone who's already getting it with their car. And that means a significant portion of the market today and potentially in the future as well, it's just like not going to engage with a program if you're only doing like a free or discounted charger giveaway. And that's a problem, right? Like if you're topping out at 20, 30, 40%, whatever it is of like a charger program, no matter how well you do it, a bunch of those EVs are just not going to engage with a managed charging program. That's problematic.
What's your sense on that, Yossi? Like, how, of the OEMs that are out there, give a percentage that you've seen that are kind of operating in that sort of space. I mean, Tesla's the big one. They've been doing that for a long time, and often that represents about 50% of the vehicles that we're talking about here. What others have you like put a percentage on it?
Yeah, if I had to, I mean, again, Tesla drives so much of this because they're most of the market share in most places, although not all. But I think you see that. I think you see it from Ford and some of the others as well. And so it's a majority. I think you can say that across the board is probably a majority in most places.
Yep.
And so right off the bat there, that's a limiting factor.
And do for VC in particular, we have a significant portion of our fleet is plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Like the most popular vehicle is a RAV4 plug-in hybrid. The next one is probably a Prius plug-in hybrid. What about those folks? Level 2 charging in the plug-in hybrid space. There's a lot of folks that are like, is it necessary? Is it needed? It also, from a charging standpoint, has a very big impact.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that gets to some of the other, I'll say limitations with charger-based programs is like from you putting like the utility hat on, like a lot of the investment is upfront and it's not necessarily tied to the benefits that you're going to get from those EVs down the road. And maybe an obvious thing is like if someone has a plug-in hybrid, I mean, they're probably doing less charging than if they had like a full battery EV. And so, but if you have like a one size fits all approach, just for like logistical reasons, if you're trying to implement a program, that divorcing the benefit you get from the upfront investment, that can be problematic, doing it that way. The other piece I would say is that, at the end of the day, if you are managing things with a charger, you don't have an insight into the vehicle. In particular, like what the state of charge for the vehicle is. And I'm sure we're going to get into this, but like that has a lot of program design implications. And just if I'm a driver and I bought this car for mobility needs and I don't mind helping my co-op or utility if there's something in it for me, but I want that to go really well. I want my needs to go first. And it's just harder for VEC or any co-op to prioritize that driver's needs if you don't know at the end of the day, like, is that state of charge at 5%? Is that state of charge at 70%? There's big difference if you're managing my charging in those two scenarios.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about connectivity and some of the challenges that, relying on customer Wi-Fi present.
Yeah. Well, again, right. Like you made this upfront investment for your reduced charger. I'm sure, everyone's going into this with good intentions, but, I don't think people are going around changing their Wi-Fi passwords like that often, but there could be all sorts of reasons why you just lose that access. And it's a pain to have to like do this follow-up and go to members and say, hey, we don't seem to be getting any readings from you. Can you help us out here? I mean, a lot of people, I think, don't have the time or the technical expertise to go in and figure that stuff out. They signed up for a program because it was easy and they got an on-bill incentive or something like that. Or an upfront investment, but having to deal with like typing in all this stuff and getting it back, like that's a pain. No one wants to go through that. And that becomes a bear to try to handle over time.
And just to add a little bit from VC too, we have a lot of detached garages. Be surprised at how many of those there are. It seems like everyone has one of those, but like the Wi-Fi signal just doesn't make it there, right? And that's it. So maybe we get a connection now and then, right? Or sometimes it's offline. And I think your admin point is really valid too. One of the biggest challenges that we face is just this workflow. We'll send out a free charger after they submit an application for that charger. That member then needs to figure out how to get that charger installed via an electrician. And there are some utility programs that kind of include that piece, right? But still another step that takes time. Then you gotta make sure that charger is connected to Wi-Fi associated with the account. And then finally, you can start doing some of this management, right? So like that could take, in some cases, we've had that take over a year. Which I know sounds crazy, but like the reality is there's shortages in electricians out there. This isn't, again, if you're in this kind of plug-in hybrid space, that might not be a necessity for you right away. You might be happy with just plugging into the wall. certainly if you have like a full EV, you're probably going to want to get that done as quick as you can. Or, maybe you're not driving that frequently. So it's, again, it's right, it might not be that big of a deal. But that administrative burden we found, having done this now for about 3 years, is a challenge and is taxing for a small utility where we have a couple folks spending maybe half of their normal role, focused on this type of stuff. And you said the technical challenges vary, right? I mean, what ends up happening is we have to decipher someone's Wi-Fi issue, recommend a Wi-Fi extender. Maybe it's an issue with this OEM's charger, and we don't really know what that is, right? We end up in this situation where we're really being like, look, we really don't know what the problem is. And then we end up putting them on a scheduled charger program, which, arguably we probably could have done without sending out this free $400 to $700 charger, right? I mean, that's the reality of how these programs are working today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that administrative component, like, I don't know if that makes it into a lot of like pro formas when you're trying to scope out, like, does this program make sense for a co-op or utility? But like, that's real,
Yeah.
especially with limited staff where they're trying to do a bunch of different things at once, wearing a bunch of different hats, running a bunch of different programs. Like, that stuff adds up. And
Right.
it just limits your ability not only to run that, but to look forward and, do what else you might have to do down the road too.
And I think too, it's important too, like, given the audience of who's listening to this, generally folks who are fairly savvy, fairly interested in the energy space, like you and I. I think it's easy sometimes to overlook how difficult this can be to someone who doesn't really understand how an EV charger works, doesn't really, like, not everyone is that excited about helping the utility, even if there is good compensation. It's not like people wake up in the morning and are like, oh, I'm so glad I saved the co-op money. Like, the vast majority of folks just kind of want the set and forget style. And if there's like these hiccups along the way, if there's issues, that then detracts from the likelihood of them successfully enrolling, right? So the more of these steps, the more complication, the less likely they're, especially as we move past the early adopter market into the mass market, which is kind of like where we're headed, right? So
Absolutely. Yep, definitely.
So we touched a little bit on the challenges of charger programs. I want to be clear, this isn't meant to be an anti-charger program. VC still has a charger program and will continue to have one. But there are hurdles. So talk to me a little bit about where telematics fits in, what it maybe solves in some of those areas. And then maybe after we can talk about, some of the challenges that also come with that, because there is no solution that, has been completely figured out yet. That's the reality of this space, right?
Yeah, definitely. So just a brief primer, even for the energy nerds out there, on what telematics is, right? I mean, cars are not like the cars that our grandfathers drove. They're computers with wheels attached increasingly. And so there's a whole lot of data that comes out of them. And those cars have a cellular connection within them. You think of like OnStar or things like that. There's a whole lot of data that's there. And what companies like FlexCharging are able to do is, via an API connection, essentially communicate with the car and those API endpoints to get data back, including like state of charge, the location, the odometer readings, things that are like relevant to a managed charging program. I'll just say a brief caveat here, which is that we get data points back, but we don't get kWh data points back, right? So a lot has to happen qualitatively and quantitatively behind the scenes, especially because we try to make this work for just about every EV that's on the road. And there's big differences between the OEMs in terms of the data quality, the data timing, all sorts of other stuff. But at the end of the day, like, we have to turn that into a language that utilities speak, which is typically like 15-minute or hourly kWh readings. I think the advantages are, one, when you're talking to the vehicle, like, you just get like so much more sophisticated information. So now we have state of charge. We can take into account the difference between someone who's come home from a long day and their battery is super low, and someone who's come home, but they just made a short trip and they're plugging in and their battery's almost topped off already. I mean, and that makes a difference operationally in terms of how you build and design a program. The other piece is that, again, we talked about like the self-limiting limitations of charger-based programs, which, just to echo your point, thumbs up on charger-based programs, right? It's important that we use every tool that we have in the toolkit here. But that being said, like, we're able to connect at FlexCharging to over 20 OEMs, which is like almost 90 models, bunch of different makes, models, and years. It's going up all the time. I mean, that's like a really inclusive thing where you can go out to your broader EV membership and say, we've got a solution for you. And I think that helps at the end of the day. So I think it solves a lot of those problems. And then the last piece, just because we touched on the Wi-Fi versus cellular thing, right? It's a different mode of talking to the vehicle. And so we're going through that cellular connection. We're not going through the member's Wi-Fi. And so we're taking out some of the, I'll say, admin headaches of trying to follow up and be their personalized Radio Shack to help them with their Wi-Fi problems.
Yeah.
And instead, relying on that cellular part of the vehicle, although that's also not without its challenges.
Yeah, and I mean, just to attest to that a little bit, we did a 10-car pilot before we moved into our full FlexCharging program, and I do not have cell service at my house. I have a Ford Lightning. One of our other staff members, Lisa Morris, she has an EV and also doesn't have great service. Both of those were able to communicate, and I think for us that was like the most interesting thing when we ran through that pilot. We were like, wow, this is a big surprise. Like, we're able to navigate this kind of member Wi-Fi challenge. And that's, super promising. You touched a little bit on state of charge and the importance of that. One of the things that we're seeing, and I think this is being seen at other utilities that have successful charging programs, is they are very good at not charging from 5 to 9. But then what happens? Everyone starts charging at 9 p.m. And now, like, maybe you miss the peak, but now you're going to set this brand new infrastructure peak at 9 p.m., right? And so I think that state of charge data then enables, right, exactly what you talked about. Like, perhaps this person needs the full charge, but I'm going to guess the vast majority, right? Our typical charging session is 2 to 3 hours. Most folks, are going to need in that range, right? That can be delayed. That could be delayed, till 3 a.m. and really not impact someone's ability to drive the next morning. And so I think, like, early on, maybe that doesn't feel like that important of a data set, but now what we're seeing are these massive peaks post-peak event. And that's causing issues, or will certainly continue to cause issues.
Yeah, definitely. Especially as you get more and more EVs, right? We're still in the early days at the end
That's
of the day, but yeah, it's totally like the children's book. If you give a mouse a cookie, like that's what we're doing. Like, we've solved the first page and then we've created a new situation. And you're exactly right. Like, all this stuff is happening at 9:01 p.m. When in reality, it doesn't have to, because there's so much inherent flexibility in the system. Like, people don't need their car charged until 5 a.m. and most people, like, that's like 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours to replace their daily driving. So there's a lot of inherent flexibility, and doing that more intelligently, which is predicated on having the right data from those cars. That's possible through software.
A lot of this EV charging space is so, like, behavioral. Like, how do you acquire said customer? How do you get them enrolled in the program? How do you build trust that this program is going to work? And I've heard a lot of feedback of, well, it's early days. Like, all these early adopters, of course, they're okay with the utility managing their charger because, they're generally more knowledgeable of the energy space, perhaps. How do you respond to that, especially as we head and continue to see these kind of increases in EVs across various utility territories?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. And I think it's also heavily dependent on what they're used to already. So this is like we certainly have a set of best practices from working across so many different spaces in terms of what we've seen that works. But I always tell people we haven't worked with your members yet. And like, some folks are just an obvious example. Like, some folks are used to time of use rates, right? They've already like had that going back to the 70s and they're used to that. Other folks are not used to that at all, right? So VC like has, I think, very little sign up on its time of use program.
Yeah, we have 47 of the 34,000. So
yeah, exactly.
Not a big winner currently.
So it's just like there's very different in terms of like what people's expectations are from other programs that have been rolled out or what they're used to. I think that you have to have like some level of incentive. We've certainly seen that, like, upfront incentives, and then having something on an ongoing basis that's either like performance or maintenance based. That is a model that tends to work. And obviously you have to make the financials work to make the program happen as well. But I think a lot of this is like there's certainly an education component. that can't be taken lightly. So, a lot of this is, how do you set up like a program landing page that really like lays this stuff out and puts it in like clear English for people to understand. And then, the last piece I would say is that you have to put their mobility needs first. I always go back to that. Like we're helping you design program if you're a utility or co-op, but we're upfront that like the program design, whatever you were trying to optimize, is going to come like second in the priority list. And the
right.
first in the priority list is like they bought this car for their own reasons, right? Their own mobility reasons. They did not go to a dealership and buy a car because they cared about peak load deferral or transformer loading.
That's right.
They don't even know what that is.
It turns out most people aren't like you and I. It's unfortunate,
they're
really.
Not. And even you, right? I mean, you didn't buy.
No, I bought it because it was the most affordable truck option I could buy, and I also, of course, was interested in what that experience was like.
Yeah. So I just think like there's a lot of little things you have to get right, because if you turn someone off, like that's it.
Yeah.
They're out of the program. They're not coming back.
That customer member trust, right, is so foundational. I mean, I think we've been fortunate in the sense that I'm unaware of an incident by which we dispatched either a charger or telematics and then negatively impacted their piece. And I think that's like so important, right? That's why like testing and making sure that these controls are working when we're first going out is like so fundamental. You want to make sure that, we're making sure that the early folks who are generally going to be a little more okay with these sorts of incidents are going to be more aware. I'll use the example of the other day I was going to charge, and it was like 8:45 and I had plugged in and my charger wasn't working, and I was panicked because my charger wasn't working and I needed a charge the next day. So I like went through the whole process. I reinstalled the charger, did all this stuff. By the time I got it all figured out, it was like 9:10. Turns out that I was enrolled in a peak management program because I was testing my vehicle. And by 9 p.m. things were fine. I was convinced it was the charger, but I had forgotten, even someone like myself who spends all the time in this space, that my car was enrolled, right? So just imagine, right, if you're someone, again, not in the energy space, you get home, you plug in and you're like, oh, wait a second, VC is managing this should be fine, right? How do you maintain that trust that when you go to bed, things are going to pick up again,
Yeah. Yep, definitely. And then we could talk all day about like the little things you have to get right, but it goes back to what I was saying about running. Like there's just like so many little things that add up to big things, and you have to really focus on them and just follow the process.
Yep. Talk to me a little bit about privacy. You and I have done a couple of presentations now. I feel like we get this privacy question a lot because people are like, oh, well, you're connecting to my vehicle. Like you must see everything that I'm doing. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a fair question. And I'm of two minds about this, because I think increasingly like our world, just about all aspects of our world are built around just, oh, this is convenient, therefore I don't mind if you're giving up a lot of my data. I mean, I've had people lecture me about like having a smart device, but like at the end of the day, like the Alexa we have in the kitchen and my kids' ability to play Taylor Swift whenever they want, like that is worth whatever they're recording. I mean, that's our family's outlook on this stuff, but it comes up on this front too. And I will say that at a high level, we talk explicitly about first of all, there's a bunch of different API endpoints for a car, and we explicitly restrict the permissions list that we ask people to give us permissions to as part of the sign-up process, just to that stuff that's relevant to a managed charging program. The ability to remote start your vehicle or open up your trunk has no bearing whatsoever on what co-op or utility is trying to do. And so we don't want that information. We don't want access to it. So that's the first piece. The second piece is, and Tesla rolled out a new API earlier this year, which was explicitly for third-party partners. And so we were really happy to sign up for that officially. That puts more control back to consumers to not only grant third parties access, but also restrict their access or remove or revoke it down the line if they want to for any reason. We've already built a bunch of like processes and workarounds. If people contact us and they say, hey, I signed up for this, but I'm no longer interested, or I'm moving or something like that. Great. We have a process for removing that, but that's not automatically the case with third parties. And so I'm hoping that one of the things that happens is the industry collectively moves more towards these like approved official pathways for third parties to register, and for consumers to be able to revoke that access over time. And then I'll just say the last piece is, again, most of the programs we've done to date, we've been doing geofencing. So if you are at home, right, and you're charging during a peak time and you're part of a program, like it says in your terms and conditions, okay, your charging might be managed. But if you're not at home, if you leave the service territory, if you're at a public charger, but it's still during an event, like you shouldn't have that charging managed for you in any way, shape, or form. And again, that's like one of the many things you got to get right to respect people's mobility needs.
Is that fairly common across the industry, that this sort of like telematics home charging is kind of the way folks are going to kind of address that? Is that a kind of common practice?
I think so, or like a workplace charging, but something that's like geographically designed.
Yep.
Again, but like you can't get too comfortable in the here and now. Like
Yep.
we're definitely seeing others start saying, how do we connect this stuff? And from a telematics standpoint, that's great. The car becomes a sub-meter, so we can see it wherever it goes, so we can connect like a workplace and a home charging program together. But other folks are worried, especially I'll say like in vacation spots, around like, how do you have maybe a more robust managed charging thing if you're like at a ski resort or at a Cape Cod or something like that. There's a whole lot of EVs that is stressing the distribution system. It's not just about peak load deferral, and maybe coming out with a more robust set of solutions there. It's early days, but I think that stuff is going to start playing out more and more.
Yeah, I mean, I could see a future by which maybe we geofence that level 2 area as well, right? Like, and if you're in that space, then maybe that gets looked at a little bit differently. So in the intro, I talked about how we launched our program in our full program in April. We'd been doing a trial for about a year. One of the things that I would say that, to touch on some of the challenges that we faced in the charger space that we don't have in the telematics space, is the administration side of things has been significantly easier, right? I mean, the way by which it goes is basically log in with your Ford, Tesla, whatever username and password, associate a vehicle, geotag your home, and generally in like probably less than 5 minutes by and large, right, you are enrolled in that program. There's no waiting for the installation to happen. I think that's like been a huge benefit to us, and has been like, again, from scaling these programs out past the kind of 50 to 100 to thousands, right? Like we're looking at that administrative burden as like very important. So I think that's been a big win. One of the things that I would say that we learned through this whole process is the differing costs that OEMs charge for access to the vehicle. So of course we're paying FlexCharging to provide the wonderful service that they do, but there are sometimes additional charges. Can you touch on that, Jossi? Like maybe just like briefly talk about like what the landscape looks like in the OEMs, kind of why some OEMs are going down that route, maybe what that looks like moving forward.
Yeah, that I wish I knew what it looked like going forward. That's the toughest one to answer. I will say, like, OEMs are obviously not a monolith, right? Like some of them are saying, hey, you just spent tens of thousands of dollars on this new car. Great, you've got telematics access to your data moving forward. It's just included and that's it. And it's going to be included, for the rest of it. And that is the majority of cars that people are buying. But it's in part the majority of cars because it includes Tesla again, right? They're the big elephant in the room. Other OEMs have taken a very different approach, which is, from day one, if you want to do all this other stuff, you're going to have to pay some amount monthly or yearly. And those costs are like, just roughly speaking, like 150, 250, somewhere in that range. That's not insignificant.
Right.
I think some people do that cost benefit and they say, oh, like having the ability to do remote start in a cold climate, yeah, that's worth it to me. And so they have no problem like being involved in a telematics program. But I mean, just put in stark terms, like if you're going to get $8 a month as a bill credit from VEC, but it costs you $100 a year to pay your OEM for the access to that data, that math doesn't really work out, right?
Right.
And then there's things in between where you buy a car and then you have like a 6 month, a 1 year, a 3 year, a 6 year free trial where, especially in these early days, a lot of folks are still within that.
Yep.
So it's all along the gradient. And again, I think it speaks to like how nascent this stuff is. Like the OEMs are still trying to figure out like what their future looks like. especially as they lose, I'll say, service opportunities because of the benefits of EVs. You need less service over time. Is there another way where they can have an ongoing relationship and maybe generate some revenue from these EVs? Some of them clearly have come out on the side of yes, and are charging folks for that access, and it makes it harder for us to run programs. Because even though technically we can connect with that vehicle, if that member doesn't have access, we just get a bunch of zeros back, and
Right.
that doesn't do any good.
And we've left our program open to anyone, but we kind of concentrate our marketing on those free OEMs, primarily Tesla, which is unfortunate. And we've considered, some folks out there are like, well, what if the utility covered those costs, right? Like, first challenge with that is we have a total value here. We're giving half of that to the member. The rest, hopefully, is a mix of savings and paying folks like you at FlexCharging, right? If we then also have to pay a telematics fee, we are no longer saving money. The program is losing money, which, might be a cost of doing business early on. But like, again, if it's, several more than the majority, right, then that's a losing proposition. And I think second is like, we don't want to be getting in the middle, giving custom bill credits to people based on the OEM they have so that we can figure out exactly what this is, right? That's just like a very complicated situation. So we'll see, I guess, where that goes, right? I mean, I do think that, one of the things I had written down here was like markets, third-party participants, maybe that's OEMs, right? Basically advertising and kind of promoting these programs to the folks that they already know, right? You purchase it from a dealer, they know who you are. One of our biggest challenges is like, we're not great marketers. That's not we're a regulated monopoly. You're stuck with us.
Yeah.
And when it comes to these programs, like marketing that out is definitely a challenge for us. So I'm hopeful that in the future, like, I think there is a partnership there that will exist. Whether or not, it's cost effective and makes sense for us, I think is the real challenge. But we're certainly very interested in building those relationships. And if we have an OEM who's marketing the program for us, great. As far as we're concerned, as long as we maintain that visibility and are pushing this button for peak dispatch, we're ending up in the same position. And I think utilities probably have varying comfort levels on what these third-party folks are doing, but certainly if you look at like what Tesla is doing and providing to Texas as an example, or even Green Mountain Power and the frequency regulation program, right? Those are very successful programs. They're demonstrating value to the utilities. They might not be directly associated with the utility, but they're still very valuable.
Yeah, I'm hoping that happens. I mean, just zooming out the big picture, like as electrification of transportation happens, you have these huge worlds of like the utility grids and the automakers just colliding more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And there just has to be communication and partnership there for that to work. It's going to have too big of an impact on the grid collectively for there not to be those conversations. And something I spend a lot of time thinking about is like, what does this look like? And how does this work for all the utilities? Because it's all well and good for, I don't know, the Duke Energies of the world,
Yeah.
but you don't want to see rural electric co-ops, and there's 900 of them, like left behind.
That's right.
At the end of the day, because you're a small fish in a much bigger pond, and they just don't have the time of day. So that stuff is important. But I agree that those partnerships make a lot of sense, and I hope that's where it's coming, and I do think it's coming soon.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to your point there on the co-op space, I mean, there's been partnerships announced between some of the larger OEMs. I think their goal, right, is to basically work directly with the utility, which I think might work for an IOU who has that capability. For us, we certainly don't want to be having a contract with Ford and then a separate contract with Toyota and then a separate contract over here. I mean, it's the same in the charging space. We have a handful of chargers we try and manage. The whole reason we work with an aggregator like FlexCharging is so that we don't have to manage all those relationships that is taxing on a small utility. And most co-ops are in the 100 to 200 or 50 to 200 employee range. They just don't have the staff or the dollars to put forth for these contracts, right? So I hope we'll see, I guess, where that space goes. You touched on this collision of OEMs and grid, and Flex recently announced a partnership with Rhythmos IO. You have an existing relationship with Camus. Other telematics vendors, I think, are trying to kind of like do some of that work themselves on like integrating AMI data and maybe some of the grid constraints. What's the value for Flex in these relationships, and where do you see that going?
For us, and I don't want to get too technical with like anagrams here, or acronyms, I should say. But we see ourselves as an edge DERMS, which basically means like we're an aggregator of devices. We don't know what's happening on the grid itself. We were reliant on either utilities or DERMS via utilities or partners to help us figure that out. And in the absence of that, we can help devices do the right thing, and participants do the right thing. So for us, like, these partnerships are great because we know what we're good at, and we know what the partners are good at, and we just form a nice complement in terms of we can help control devices, and they can help us figure out like what's the optimal way to manage this stuff for the grid. And I think that's what's great. And I'll just say, at the end of the day, that's part of what's so exciting about this stuff, is that it is evolving pretty quickly. There's a lot of solutions, and I think this is the story again and again in clean energy, but the technologies and the capabilities are in some ways moving faster than the deployment. And so the onus is on all of us to try to deploy this stuff quicker, because the solutions are there to make this stuff work.
I think it's interesting too, because I mean, the utilities are in various stages of what they're trying to do, right? I think your peak shaving example, it's like a lot of these integrations might not be necessary, right? If your goal is to push a button or send a signal that says don't charge from 5 to 9, you don't need a sophisticated ADMS integration, right?
Yep.
I think the idea here is like you're building these programs in a way where you have folks enrolled, and now you're value stacking. You're adding things like T&D asset deferral. You're adding things like, other grid services, right? And so I think that's where that comes in. If you're going to value stack, often you're going to need visibility of what's happening. What is the constraint you're trying to manage? What is the infrastructure you're trying to delay, right? And that often will start to involve folks in the engineering side, folks in the control center, folks in the operations side. They're not just going to want you to rely on someone pushing a button. That's not going to work if you're trying to, manage a charger for a distribution transformer asset deferral, or manage a charger for ISO New England's regional constraint, right? That's not going to work. No one's going to be sitting there pushing that button. So you need some sophistication. So it's just interesting how that's shaping out, right? And that space, I think, is very nascent. There are a lot of players. There are a lot of folks who are doing some of this stuff. There's, folks in the telematics space who are trying to do a little bit of both. There's folks like you all who are like, look, we'll partner with whoever. We're going to focus here where we know we're good. And we know that there's other folks who are going to concentrate in this other space, right?
Yeah. And it goes back to the thing we were talking about before, just in a different context, like trust, right? Because the solutions are there technically. I mean, if you woke up tomorrow and said, I want to do X, Y, or Z, I'm sure you could find vendors to do that, but you have to trust that they're going to do it the right way and it's going to work for your membership. And a lot of times that's like a crawl, walk, run approach. So, we work with a lot of co-ops where we come in and we just say, okay, let's define something small and prove to you it works, and that this is going to work together. And then you can always add pieces, to the next stages over time. Let's do a billing integration. Let's do a DERMS integration. Let's do more sophisticated managed charging, et cetera, et cetera. But it can build over time, but you don't have to do it right off the bat and get stuck in paralysis analysis.
Yeah, and arguably to your last point, right? Like that's what can happen, right? If you like bring in this vendor and you're like, no, it needs to integrate with everything. It's like, you're never going to get that off the ground because once you start weaving in all these things, it's going to add so much complexity and cost. And like, really, it's like, look, you're trying to demonstrate some initial value. You can always build on that. That's been our strategy, at least. So, one question I had written down here is, given the conversation we've just had on telematics and managed charging, managed chargers, I should say, they're all in the managed charging space. If you were to look at the future of managed charging, do you see like telematics taking the lead? Do you see like a continued kind of like duality happening? What's your perspective been, given kind of who you're working with?
I hope it's not all telematics. Maybe that's strange to say. It's a telematics first organization, but again, like we need to electrify everything as quickly as possible and decarbonize the grid as quickly as possible. And so we need all the tools available in the toolbox. So if you have a program and it's working, and again, we talked about some of the challenges, but if you have something that's working, you should continue doing that. And if you can add more in, I think that works. A lot of what I think the best and most forward-thinking co-ops and utilities are doing is basically like offering a menu of options to members and getting them to say yes to one thing. And that's how they're getting to like 80% penetration. So some people might be comfortable with like a whole house time of use rate, that primarily helps you if you're an EV owner. And other people might say, you know what, I don't want to be stressed out about running my dryer during a non-peak period. I don't want to have to think about that. And so give them something else, give them some other way to say yes. And I think we're often coming in with co-ops and utilities that have already rolled out successful things, and they're saying, hey, here's what we have that works, and that's great. But we know it's only 40% of the available EVs. What can we do next?
Yep.
So I hope it's everything, and I think it has to be everything, because we need to find as many viable options as possible that are cost effective, because that's how you get to things.
That's right. That's right. I love that idea. Love this menu of options concept. That's definitely, I think that's where the space is right now. Again, right? Like nascent space, lots of different kind of philosophies and strategies. I don't think any one of them works better than the other yet. There's no like defined pathway for like, hey, this is how you manage the devices on the system. So that strategy is very much kind of where we lie today. And maybe that'll suss itself out, especially with these OEM relationships. If there's some alignment that starts to form there, then maybe there's a good pathway. I'd be remiss not to talk about vehicle to grid. I had that listed on here. I will say that I hear so much about vehicle to grid, and it seems like people are doing a lot of really cool stuff. But the fact of the matter is, outside of Fermata Energy, and they have a 3-phase Nissan Leaf only device, which they're doing some very cool programs. Shout out to them for kind of like spearheading that effort. But on like the single phase residential space, there are no vehicle to grid chargers that are out there. I guess I just want to make that clear to folks. Even some of the stuff with like the Ford Lightning, my understanding is those are only vehicle to home, i.e. if you have an outage, yes, your Lightning can kick on. And my understanding is they're starting to explore what vehicle to grid looks like that is capable to do that stuff. But the space it's very early. Even though there's a lot of promise, it's very early. So I guess what's your take on kind of where we're at? How does Flex fit into that? And what could that look like?
Yeah, I hope everyone had vehicle to grid on their bingo card, because that's such an obvious thing to have down. I think that the ratio of exciting looking press releases or news articles about here's what's coming versus what's actually like being used or that you can buy, or that even like FlexCharging and VEC can like build like a small scale demo around, so we can
which we'd love to do, by the way, for those folks listening. We're in. Give us one. We'll buy one.
Yep, exactly. But it's a very big discrepancy right now between those two things. But it gets so much attention in part because it's so exciting, right?
Yeah.
And instead of like deferring a small amount of load, if you're putting it back on the grid, it's going to drastically change how valuable these programs are to the grid. And that's going to be good for presumably a higher level of incentives, which will get even more people interested in participating. And it's really just a wonderful feedback loop and snowball effect. That being said, like, I'll just be clear, like from a telematics standpoint, like there is no capability for us to discharge the vehicles. So we are a company that's been built on software of talking to the vehicles, but we're going to be dependent on some sort of vehicle to grid hardware in order to make this stuff happen. And so we're definitely excited to do that. We definitely would love to come back in a year and have this whole podcast be about like the successful demonstration we did. But we need those hardwares to come out so that we can start doing that stuff. But that's where this stuff is headed eventually. And it's a lot of excitement, but not a lot that you can actually do at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add some numbers to that, VC has a battery program today, right? Where, typical batteries like 5-10 kilowatts, right? We compensate them based on the number of kilowatts that they do. It's $6.40 per kilowatt. So it's roughly, between $30 and $60 a month is what folks are compensated. Our EV program is 8 kilowatts, is $8 a month. 1 kilowatt is the average that we kind of see, because not everyone's charging at the same time. So we use an average across the fleet, right? So if we were able to have someone dispatch even at 5 kilowatts or 10 kilowatts, we would, 5x, 10x the value that we are providing to folks, right? And all of a sudden, to have your vehicle plugged in for a handful of events a month, you could be covering your whole charging cost, which would be like a pretty tremendous win, right? And leveraging existing batteries that are out there rather than what are still fairly expensive Tesla Powerwalls. Yes, the cost is coming down, but look, it's still between $10,000 and $15,000 to go put one of those into your house. Why not leverage the battery you already have outside, right? I think there's other concerns on OEM warranties, kind of degradation of batteries, right? All these sorts of things that need to get figured out. But I think really the biggest constraint is we don't have anything out there to test yet, really, especially in the single phase residential space, which for VC is kind of where we're trying to play in. So it kind of like ends what I wanted to cover, Jossi. Anything that you feel like we didn't cover, anything that feel like we should touch on? We can leave it at
Yeah,
that.
I just, we keep talking about like the present and the future. I mean, I'm curious where you see things going in the next 6 months or so, and how you keep your eyes on like what's moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's my favorite space is not today, to be honest with you. My wife tells me that a lot, that I should be more present. So, really, I think what we're trying to do is leverage these existing peak management programs to start looking at additional grid services. And I would say the biggest one we are interested in today is T&D asset deferral. And so VC has 1.2 meters per transformer. That means if you're installing a 7 kilowatt charger or 6 kilowatt or a 19 kilowatt charger, which we have several of those out there, and you're on a 10 kVA transformer, that can start to meaningfully impact that distribution transformer. So what we're trying to do is how can we leverage these peak management programs, provide additional benefit to people, and value deferring that asset? You might be able to defer that transformer 10 years, 20 years. It's going to get upgraded at some point, but we have significant amounts of grid infrastructure upgrades that we need to do on the system. And so that flexibility is really valuable to us. Or we're not just going to be able to 2x the grid in the next 10 years. It's just not going to happen, and no utility is going to be able to do that. Sorry, Elon Musk. So really what we're excited about is starting to pilot that. And then, as we start to see issues on primary lines, issues on substation transformers, issues on the transmission system, we can leverage those exact same programs to do those sorts of services, right? That's challenging. It means we have to figure out like what is the value of deferring that asset, the technology stack behind it. Obviously, our integration with Camus and FlexCharging is going to be a very key way of making that happen. Regulatory frameworks. And then, just the member side of things. You think it's difficult explaining someone why it's valuable to shave peaks. Good luck explaining them how we're going to manage their charger for transformers or a system constraint, right? So you're going to have to build this trust of like, hey, we're going to manage your charger. We're also probably not going to send out opt-out emails anymore because this is just going to happen. Your charger is just going to get managed and you're going to be compensated for it. And so I think that's going to be an interesting exploration on consumer behavior and working through the program design aspect, and then seeing how it works. Hopefully we can demonstrate some actual value. And to your point, when we have demonstrated that actual value, I'd love to chat about how we made that happen.
Well, I look forward to living in tomorrow with you in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Well, sweet, Jossi. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's great chatting with you. And let's hope that by next year we got something exciting to share in addition.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Hope folks gained some insight from this episode. Jossi is truly a joy to work with and is always looking to find new ways to make our programs more successful, whether through new functionality or how to make these programs simpler for our members. If you like this episode, please click subscribe on YouTube or Spotify, and see you next time.